My name is Lauren Mercer. I'm 39 years old. In the afternoon, my stepmother handed me a cardboard box with my own mother's wedding china wrapped in yesterday's newspaper. She told me, in a voice pitched for the porch full of relatives behind her, that it was time I took what was mine and let the family move forward without dragging up the past. There were 14 people on that porch in Brunswick, Georgia, and every one of them was looking at me holding a box of my dead mother's dishes like I was the one who had shown up somewhere I did not belong. I want to tell you about a woman named Denise, because you cannot understand the box, or the porch, or what happened 4 months later in a lawyer's office with a document nobody but me knew existed, until you understand exactly how patient a person can be. I am a structural engineer. I have spent 14 years in Savannah certifying that buildings will not fall down, and I need you to sit with that for a second, because it is the whole shape of what is coming. My job is to look at a thing everyone else assumes is solid, a beam, a foundation, a load path, and find the one point where the weight is not actually going where people think it is going. I have signed my name to reports that stopped construction on buildings other engineers approved, because I found the hairline thing nobody else looked for. My family thought this made me difficult. Lauren finds problems, my father used to say, fondly, at first, and then, later, less fondly, as if finding problems were a personality flaw rather than the actual skill he had paid for my education to develop. My mother, Carol Ann Mercer, died when I was 26, ovarian cancer, 18 months from diagnosis to the end, and I moved home to Brunswick for the worst of it, took leave from my first engineering job to sit with her, and my father, Walt, grieved the way solid, quiet men grieve, by working longer hours at the marina he had run for 30 years and saying almost nothing. And for 2 years after she died, it was just the two of us. Sunday dinners, him teaching me to recaulk the boat, me pretending I did not already know how because he needed to teach somebody something. I still remember the particular quiet of those 2 years, the two of us at his kitchen table on a Sunday evening, him telling the same 3 stories about the marina's early days that he had told 100 times before, and me letting him tell them again, because grief, I learned watching him, does not always look like tears. Sometimes it looks exactly like an old man needing to say a familiar sentence one more time to make sure the world was still holding together the way he remembered it. And then Denise came into the marina office looking for a slip rental in the spring I turned 29, and within a year she was living in my mother's house, and within 2 years she was my father's wife. And I want to be fair to her for a moment, because fairness is the whole engine of this, and if I make her a cartoon, then I have lost before I have started. Denise Calloway, as she was then, was 51 when she married my father, warm in the specific way of women who have learned that warmth is the fastest route into a room. She remembered everyone's birthday. She brought my father soup when his back went out. She redid the kitchen my mother had loved with a tasteful hand, and everyone in Brunswick said how good it was to see Walt Mercer smiling again, and I said it too, because it was true, and because I did not yet understand that a person can genuinely make someone happy and still be building something underneath the happiness the whole time. I want you to hold both of those facts at once, the way I have had to, because it would be so much easier if Denise had simply been cruel from the first day. If there had been a single moment early on I could point to and say, there, that is where it started. But there was no such moment. There was only a slow accumulation of small kindnesses that each, on its own, deserved to be called exactly what it looked like, which was love. And it is precisely that accumulation, and not any single cruelty, that made the whole thing so difficult to see clearly, until it was very nearly too late. My father was happier with Denise than he had been in years. And Denise spent those years, patiently, methodically, moving herself into every load-bearing position in his life. It started small, the way it always does. She began managing his calendar, because Walt was getting older and forgetful, she said, and that was true too. He was 74 by then, and starting to repeat himself. She began coming to his doctor's appointments, all of them, and answering the questions before he could, gently, the way you finish a tired man's sentences. She began handling the marina's books, the ones my father had kept in his head for 30 years, moving them onto a laptop only she had the password to. And every single one of these things, taken alone, looked exactly like love, and that is the thing I need you to understand before anything else, because it took me years to understand it myself. Isolation does not usually arrive as a slammed door. It arrives as help. It arrives as "I've got it, honey, don't you worry about that," said so warmly, so many times, that by the time you notice you have stopped being consulted about your own father's life, the not consulting has already become the custom. I notice things at a distance, the way you notice a hairline crack from across a room, not yet sure if it is structural or cosmetic. My Sunday calls to my father started going to voicemail more, and Denise would call back instead, chatty, full of updates. "Daddy's doing great, he's just resting," and I told myself that was normal, that men in their 70s rest more, and I let 2 years go by telling myself that. I want to give you 2 specific mornings from those years, because a pattern is only believable if you can see what it is built from. There was a morning I drove down unannounced, a Saturday, meaning to surprise him, and I found him alone at the kitchen table with the newspaper, genuinely delighted to see me, the old delight, undiluted, and we sat and talked for almost an hour the way we used to before Denise, about the marina, about a heron that had taken to fishing off the dock, about nothing, the good kind of nothing, and it was the closest I had felt to my own father in 3 years. Denise came home from her sister's around noon, and within 20 minutes of her walking through the door, my father had gone quiet again, had stopped finishing his own sentences, had started looking to her before answering even simple questions like whether he wanted iced tea, and I remember driving back to Savannah that afternoon with a feeling I could not name yet. A feeling I would only later learn to call by its right name, which was that I had just watched a light get dimmed by someone's hand on the switch, gradually, without a single word said that anyone could point to as unkind. There was another morning, almost 2 years later, when I called ahead this time, and Denise answered my father's cell phone, which she had started carrying for him, she said, because he kept forgetting where he put it, and she told me he was resting and could not come to the phone, and in the background, faint, I heard him ask who was calling, and I heard her say quietly, away from the receiver but not quite far enough, "It's nobody, honey. Go on back to your show." And I sat in my car in a Savannah parking garage with the phone against my ear and felt something in my chest go cold and specific. Because nobody is not a word you use about your own daughter unless you have already decided, somewhere along the way, that the word fits. My father's decline, when it came the way these things come, slow and then suddenly not slow at all. A small stroke 2 years ago left his left hand weak and his speech a little thick at the edges, nothing that should have taken his independence. The doctor was clear about that. Mild cognitive effects, expected to improve, no diagnosis of incapacity. I have that in writing because I asked for it in writing, because by then the hairline crack had widened enough that I had started, quietly, the way I quietly document everything, keeping my own file. And it was after that stroke that Denise moved my father's affairs entirely into her name, a general power of attorney, signed at his bedside in the hospital, in the same week, I would learn much later, that she also had him sign something else, something with much larger stakes, something that would sit unmentioned for 2 years until the day of the box on the porch. I want to tell you about my mother's letter, because it is the reason any of what follows was possible, and because none of them, not Denise, not my father in his confusion, not one single person at that porch, ever knew it existed until the day I made sure they did. My mother, in the last 6 months of her illness, when she was lucid enough to think clearly about what would happen to my father after she was gone, drove herself, with me driving actually, to see an estate attorney in Savannah named Harold Ames, a colleague of a colleague, recommended as thorough and old-fashioned and slow to bill, and she had him draft something my father did not know about at the time and, I believe, forgot entirely by the time it would have mattered, because grief and then Denise's warmth had a way of erasing the sharp administrative edges of those last months. My mother put the house on Egret Lane, the one on the water that had been in her family for 3 generations before she married my father, into an irrevocable trust, naming my father as the life beneficiary, meaning he could live in it, enjoy it, use it, for as long as he lived, but naming me as the sole remainder beneficiary, And, critically, as the successor trustee the moment my father either died or was found by two independent physicians to lack the capacity to manage his own affairs. She did this not because she distrusted my father. She did this, she told me once, in the hospital, holding my hand with the strength that was leaving her a little more every day, because she had watched her own mother's second husband slowly absorb everything her mother owned after she died. And she was not going to let history do that twice in one family, and she made me promise never to mention it to my father unless the day came that I needed to, because she did not want him living the rest of his life feeling watched, feeling like his wife's daughter did not trust whoever he might someday love. I recorded that trust in the county the same month it was signed, quietly, the way I do everything, because a document that is not recorded is a document that is only as strong as everyone's memory, and memory, I have learned, is the least structurally sound material there is. So when Denise, 4 months ago, decided the time had come to formally settle what she called Walt's affairs and gathered the family onto the porch of the house on Egret Lane, the house my mother's grandfather built, to announce that she and my father had decided, together, she said, together, though my father sat beside her in his porch chair saying almost nothing, his weak hand resting on his knee, that the house was going to be sold, that the market in coastal Georgia had never been better, that a young couple from Atlanta had already made an offer north of $1 million, and that the proceeds would fund what Denise described as Walt's comfortable retirement, meaning, I understood without being told, her own. She had absolutely no idea that the house had not belonged, in any legal sense that mattered, to my father alone for the last 13 years. I need to give you the whole porch, because it is the whole trap, laid out in warm Georgia sunlight with sweet tea sweating on a side table. My father in his chair, quieter than I had ever seen him, nodding along to sentences I am not certain he had chosen. Denise standing, always standing when she made an announcement, the way some people need their whole body to deliver a sentence. Her son from her first marriage, Trent, 36, who had moved to Brunswick the year after the wedding and taken an increasingly comfortable position managing the marina my father had built with his own hands, a marina Trent had never once, in 4 years, opened before 9 in the morning. Denise's sister Pam nodding along from the porch swing, and me standing at the rail with a glass of tea I had not touched, watching my father's weak hand and understanding, the way you understand a load path the moment you actually look for it, that something in this family had been quietly redirected while I was an hour and a half away signing my name to other people's buildings. Denise handed me the box then, my mother's wedding china, 12 place settings wrapped in newspaper, and she said the sentence I opened this story with, that it was time I took what was mine and let the family move forward, and I understood, holding that box, that I was being paid off. I was being handed my mother's dishes as a settlement, a closing gift, so that the house, the actual load-bearing asset, the water, the dock, the 3 generations, could move cleanly into a sale that funded a life I was not going to be part of. Trent stood beside his mother with his arms crossed, and he was the one who said it plainly, in the easy voice of a man who has never once had to build anything himself. Lauren, nobody's trying to cut you out. It's just time to be practical. Dad's getting older, and Mom's been the one actually here. Here is the moment I nearly folded, and I need to tell you about it honestly, because if I make myself brave from the very first sentence, I have lied to you. And the whole point of what my mother built for me only works because it works even for people who are, for a little while, not brave at all. Standing at that rail, holding that box, watching my father's weak hand and Denise's warm, patient face and Trent's easy certainty, I felt the old undertow, the one that says just let it go. Lauren, don't make a scene, don't be the difficult one, don't be the one who finds problems at your own father's celebration. I thought about simply taking the box, thanking them, driving back to Savannah and letting the sale close, letting my mother's trust sit unspoken in a filing cabinet forever, because activating it meant standing in front of my father and telling him, in front of his wife and her son and her sister, that the house he believed he could sell was never entirely his to sell, and some tired, conflict-averse part of me would have paid almost anything in that moment not to have to say that sentence out loud on a porch full of people already looking at me like the intruder. I want to be honest about how far that thought actually traveled, because it went further than I am proud of. I pictured the whole rest of the drive home, 90 minutes of coastal highway, the box of china rattling gently in the back seat, and I pictured myself calling Owen from the road and telling him it was done. It was over. Dad was going to sell the house and live out his days comfortable and quiet with Denise, and that I had decided, finally, to just let a family that had already decided who I was in it keep deciding. Because fighting for a house I did not even live in felt, in that particular moment, like fighting for the right to keep being unwelcome somewhere. I have spent 14 years being the engineer who finds the problem nobody wants found, and I understood, standing at that rail, that there is a specific and very human exhaustion that comes from being right in a room that resents you for it. And for about 90 seconds, holding my mother's dishes, I was tired enough to let the exhaustion win. It was my husband Owen who stood a step behind me the whole time, who leaned in and said the only thing he said all afternoon, quiet enough that only I could hear it. He said, "Lauren, look at his hand." And I looked at my father's weak hand resting on his knee, the hand that used to caulk a hull without a single wasted motion, and I understood that whatever my father had agreed to on this porch, he had agreed to it the way he had been agreeing to things for 2 years, softly, from a step behind his own life, and that the box in my arms was not a gift, it was an eviction notice dressed as an inheritance, and that if I drove back to Savannah and said nothing, I would be doing the one thing my mother had specifically built a legal instrument to prevent me from having to watch happen twice. Owen has known me 11 years. Long enough to know that I do not decide things quickly, and long enough to know exactly when I have finished deciding. And he told me afterward that he could see it happen. Standing there, a kind of stillness come over me, the same way he says it comes over me right before I sign my name to a report that is going to stop somebody's construction cold. And he said he almost felt sorry for the porch, the way you feel sorry for a bridge that does not yet know an inspector has found the crack. I set the box down on the porch rail. Before I tell you what happened next on the porch, I need to tell you about the phone call I made the night before, because it is the part that makes the difference between an accusation and a plan. After that Saturday morning I described, the one where I watched the light dim the moment Denise walked back through the door, I had driven straight to Bull Street instead of home, unannounced, and found Harold Ames still at his desk past 6 in the evening, 79 years old then, reading glasses pushed up into white hair, a man who bills slowly because he thinks slowly and correctly, in that order. I told him what I had seen, and he did not seem surprised. The way old men who have drafted a great many careful documents are rarely surprised by the reasons those documents eventually get used. He pulled my mother's file himself, from a cabinet that still had her name on the tab in ink that had faded to the color of weak tea, and he read it over again with me sitting across from him, and he told me plainly what I already suspected but needed to hear from someone whose signature carried the weight of law. He said the trust was airtight, drafted specifically to survive exactly this kind of pressure. Because Carol, he said, had asked him more than once during the drafting whether a determined second wife could ever find a way around it, and he had built in every safeguard he knew how to build, precisely because she had asked the question with such quiet, specific fear. He told me something else that night that I have carried with me since, which is that my mother had cried only once in his office, across all the appointments it took to finish the document, and it was not when she signed it, and it was not when she talked about dying. It was when she asked him to write in the clause, protecting my father's right to live in the house for the rest of his life, no matter what, no matter who he married, no matter what anyone else in the family ever thought he should do with it, because she wanted him safe and comfortable and never once made to feel like a guest in his own home, even after she was gone, even if he loved somebody else. Harold told me that, and then he closed the file and said, "So now you know why it's built the way it's built, and it's built to hold." And then he told me something practical, which was that if the day ever came that I needed to invoke it, I should not do it alone in a room full of people who had already decided what kind of daughter I was. He told me to bring the actual recorded copy, not a description of it, because a described document can be argued with, and a document sitting on a table cannot. And he told me one more thing, gentle but firm, in the voice he probably used decades ago, telling my mother the very same thing. He said, "Lauren, you will want to soften this when the moment comes, because that is who you are, and I am telling you now, while you are calm and nobody is crying yet, don't soften it. State it once, plainly, and then let it sit there and do its work." That is exactly what I did 4 months later on that porch, and it is the only reason it worked the way it did. I did not raise my voice. I want that on the record because it is the whole spine of what my mother's carefulness and my own training taught me, and I am trying to hand it to you. I did not raise my voice. I said quietly that I did not think the house was going to be sold, actually, and Denise laughed, not unkindly, the confident laugh of a woman who has never once had the ground taken out from under her, and said, "Honey, it's already under contract," and I said, "It can't be, because Dad doesn't have the authority to put it under contract," and the porch went very still in the particular way a room goes still when someone has said a sentence nobody has a script for. Denise recovered fast, because she always recovers fast. That was her whole gift. She said, "Lauren, I understand this is hard, seeing your mother's house go, but your father is perfectly capable of making his own decisions." And I looked at her and said, "I'm not questioning whether he's capable, Denise. I'm telling you he doesn't own the house outright, and hasn't for 13 years. And I told them, plainly, in one paragraph, because a mechanism only needs explaining once before it should get out of the way of the people it concerns. I told them that my mother, in the last months of her life, had placed the house on Egret Lane into an irrevocable trust, naming my father as life beneficiary with full right to live in it and enjoy it for as long as he lived, but naming me as the remainder beneficiary and successor trustee, meaning that while my father could live in that house until his last breath, he could not sell it because it was not his to sell. It belonged to the trust, and the trust's instructions, made 13 years ago by a woman none of them had been in this family long enough to have ever met, said the house passed to me. Trent laughed the way Denise had laughed, except his had an edge in it that hers had not yet found. He said that was insane, that no wife signs away her husband's own house behind his back, and I said, she didn't sign away anything of his. Trent, the house was hers before it was ever his, 3 generations of her family, and she protected it the same way anybody protects a thing they're afraid will get lost after they're gone. And I watched Denise's face do the thing I had been waiting 14 years as an engineer to see a structure do, which is fail exactly at the point nobody had bothered to reinforce, because in 4 years of managing every account, every password, every calendar entry, every doctor's appointment, Denise Calloway had never once thought to have the actual deed to the house on Egret Lane pulled and read, because she had assumed, the way people always assume about the thing that is right in front of them, that the walls she lived inside of belonged to the man whose name was on the mailbox. Then Denise attacked the wrong thing, and I had known she would, because they always do. She did not ask to see the trust. Not once that whole afternoon did anyone ask to see the document I was describing. Instead, she turned on me, and she did it warmly at first, the way she does everything, saying that this was exactly the kind of manipulation she'd worried about for years, that I had clearly gotten to my father while he was weak and vulnerable and convinced him to sign something behind her back, that I had always resented her for making my father happy, that I couldn't stand to see him loved by someone who wasn't my mother, and that this whole story about a trust was something I had probably cooked up myself with a lawyer to steal a house out from under a dying man's wife. She was pointing at me, her warm face gone tight and small, and the terrible, beautiful thing, the thing I want you to hold, is that she was accusing me of manipulating a man I had not managed to get on the phone for more than 5 unminuted minutes at a time in 2 years, over a document signed and recorded a full 4 years before Denise Calloway ever walked into my father's marina office looking for a slip. I let her finish. That is a thing my mother taught me without ever saying it in words, just by being a woman who thought years ahead of the people trying to outmaneuver her, and I have learned that if you let someone attacking the wrong object keep swinging, the room starts to see the object they are missing. Pam, on the porch swing, had gone very quiet, and I watched her eyes go to my father and then away, and I understood that some part of the family had already done math they were not saying out loud. Pam set down her own glass of tea, untouched, on the porch boards beside her feet, and I noticed her hands were folded very tightly in her lap, the particular stillness of a woman deciding, in real time, which sister-in-law she was actually married to in spirit. Somewhere down at the dock, a halyard was clanking against a mast in the afternoon breeze, a small, patient metal sound, and I have thought since that the clanking was the truest thing on that porch, because it did not care whose name was on the deed. It just kept marking time while people argued about ownership of a thing none of them had bothered to read the paper on. My father spoke then, for the first time in nearly 20 minutes, and his voice was thick at the edges the way it had been since the stroke, and it was the sentence that changed the shape of the whole afternoon. He said, "Carol did that," and it was not a question. I watched something move behind his eyes, something surfacing out of 2 years of soft deference, and he said it again, quieter, mostly to himself. "Carol did that. She told me she was going to see somebody about the house, after she got sick. I forgot. I forgot all about it." And Denise turned to him, fast, and said, "Walt, honey, that doesn't sound right." And my father, for the first time in longer than I could remember, did not immediately fold into her correction. He said, "No, Denise, I remember now. Lauren drove me. Harold Ames's office, over on Bull Street. I signed something. Carol said it was for later. For after." I had brought a folder with me, the way I bring a folder to every site I am asked to certify, because I do not walk into a load-bearing question without documentation, and I set it on the side table, next to the sweating pitcher of tea, and I opened it, and I laid the recorded trust on top, book and page and county stamp, the same kind of proof I put my name behind 14 times a year on buildings that are not going to fall down. I said, "Dad, do you remember this?" And my father, slow, his weak hand trembling slightly as he reached for it, held that document and read it, really read it, the way you read something after 2 years of being read to instead, and he said, "That's Harold's seal. That's my signature. I remember signing this." Denise reached for the folder herself then, fast, and Trent stood up out of his chair, and for a moment I thought the whole porch was going to come apart into shouting, and I want you to know that it did not, because I did not let it, because my mother did not build me a weapon that required volume to work. I put my hand flat on the folder, not snatching it away, just steady, and I said, quietly, "You can read every page, Denise, that's what it's for, but you should know, before you do, that Harold Ames is still practicing in Savannah, and he has the original in his files, and the county recorder has had a copy for 13 years, and none of that changes based on how loudly anyone talks about it on this porch." The room broke, and not toward me. That is the part people always expect wrong. Trent went first, the way the losing side always goes first, because they never turn and look at themselves, they turn and look for who to blame. He said this was exactly why he never trusted me, that I had always been the cold one, off in Savannah building my career while his mother was the one actually here, actually caring for Walt every single day, and that I didn't get to swoop in with a lawyer's trick and take the one asset that was supposed to secure his mother's future after everything she had given up. And I let him say all of it, because he was pointing at Denise's 4 years of presence and calling my mother's 13-year-old paperwork a trick, and every person on that porch who had been quiet, Pam on the swing, my father in his chair, could hear exactly how much weight that accusation was resting on a foundation nobody had checked. And then, because I have learned that the ones who are losing look for who to blame right up until the last possible second, Denise said the thing that finally moved my father all the way from the corner of the porch back into the middle of his own life. She turned to him, her voice gone thin and pleading in a way I had genuinely never heard it, and she said, "Walt, tell them. Tell them we talked about this. Tell them you want to sell." And my father looked at her for a long moment, his weak hand still resting on the trust in his lap, and he said, so quietly I almost missed it, "I don't remember us talking about it, Denise. I remember you telling me it was already decided." That was the humanizing moment, and I want to give it to Denise honestly, because it is real and it matters. In the silence after my father's sentence, I watched something true move across her face, something that was not performance, a genuine fear, the fear of a woman in her 60s who had built a life around a man's comfort, and had just watched the floor of that life get pulled up in front of her son and her sister and the stepdaughter she had never managed to fully absorb. And for one moment I felt the old pull, the enormous undertow to soften it, to say something kind, to tell her it would be all right, because she was frightened and she had, in her own way, made my father happy for years, and some of that happiness had been real. I opened my mouth to say something gentler than what came next. And Denise, in the very same breath as her fear, turned back to me and said, "Well, then we'll just have to have Walt declared competent to override whatever your mother set up, because a man has a right to sell his own home." And I closed my mouth, because that was the canceling line. That was the whole pattern in one sentence. A woman frightened and cornered reaching. Instinctively, immediately. Not for her husband's comfort, but for the next legal maneuver that might still get her the house. And I understood that whatever fear I had just watched cross her face, it had not changed a single thing about what she actually wanted. I told them what the trust would actually do, because it was time they heard it plainly. My father could live in that house on Egret Lane for the rest of his life, exactly as he always had. No one evicting him, no one rushing him anywhere. The trust required nothing of him but breathing. Denise could live there with him, for as long as they were married and he chose to have her there, that was never in question and never had been. What could not happen, what my mother had specifically paid a careful old attorney to make impossible, was the house being sold out from under my father while he was alive, or the proceeds of it funding anyone's retirement, but the very particular one my mother had pictured, which was my father, safe, on the water, in the house her family built, for as long as he lived, with the house passing, whole, to me, when he no longer needed it. Denise said no by threatening. She said we would see each other in court, that no judge in Glynn County was going to let some engineer's dead mother's paperwork override a living husband's wishes, and I said, calmly, that I hoped it did not come to court, but that if it did, I would bring the same folder, and Harold Ames, who was 81 now and still sharp, and my father's own recorded memory of signing it, spoken out loud on this porch in front of 5 witnesses. Trent gathered his mother's things. My father did not get up. He sat in his chair with the trust still in his lap, and as Denise moved toward the porch steps, gathering her purse, her voice gone tight and controlled in the way of someone already rehearsing her version for whoever she would call first, my father said one more thing, to her back, quiet, not unkind, just final. He said, "Denise, I do want you to stay. I want us to stay married. I just don't want to sell Carol's house. Those are 2 different things, and I don't know why nobody let them stay 2 different things. That was 4 months ago. I am going to tell you how it settled, because you have stood with me on that porch long enough to earn the after, and the after is quieter than the break, which is how you know it is true." There was no court case in the end because Harold Ames, in his 81-year-old thorough, old-fashioned way, had drafted the trust so carefully 13 years earlier that the attorney Denise eventually hired, a younger man out of Atlanta with a much shinier office than Harold's, told her in their very first meeting that there was nothing to litigate, that an irrevocable trust properly executed and recorded before any of this ever began was not a thing a disappointed spouse could unwind with an argument about fairness, however genuinely she believed her own argument. That was the end of the legal chapter, and it cost Denise, I later learned from Pam, several $1,000s in fees to be told a thing I had told her for free on the porch. Trent no longer runs the marina. That was not my doing, not directly, though I will admit I did nothing to stop it. My father, once the fog of 2 years began lifting the way fog does when the sun that had been blocking it finally moves, quietly reviewed the marina's books himself for the first time since his stroke, sitting at his own kitchen table with his weak hand and a magnifying glass, and found what a man who ran that business for 30 years knows how to find: a pattern of comfortable hours and uncomfortable numbers. And he did not have Trent arrested, and he did not make a scene. He simply told him, gently but without room for negotiation, that the marina needed a manager who opened before 9, and Trent left Brunswick for Jacksonville that same month. And I am told he tells people down there that his stepfather's family froze him out of a business he built, And I have made a strange peace with that, because some people need a villain, and I would rather be the villain in Trent's story than the trustee in the one where I said nothing. I want to tell you what my father actually found in those books, because it matters to understanding the shape of the whole 4 years, not just the house. Slip rentals that had been discounted on paper to friends of Trent's who turned out, on closer inspection, to be paying cash directly to Trent and a lesser official rate to the marina. A difference my father estimated, once he had gone through a full 18 months of records line by line, the way he used to check a hull for rot, at something close to $30,000 that had quietly never made it into the business he had spent 30 years building. He did not tell Denise the full number, not because he was protecting her, but because, he told me once on the phone, in his slow, careful voice, he had decided there was no version of that conversation that would change what Trent had done, and he was tired, he said, of conversations that existed only to make someone else feel better about something that could not be undone. He simply changed the locks on the office, moved the accounts to a bank 2 towns over, where nobody in the family had ever set foot, and hired a manager from Savannah who opens the gate at 6 in the morning, rain or shine, the way my father used to. Pam called me about 3 weeks after the porch, which surprised me, because in 14 years Pam and I had exchanged maybe a dozen sentences total, mostly about weather and casseroles. She said she had been sitting with something and needed to say it once and would not bring it up again, and what she said was that she had known about the trust, or at least suspected something like it, for years, because Denise had mentioned once, offhand, years back, complaining lightly the way you complain about a stubborn stain, that Walt kept a folder from some old Savannah lawyer that he wouldn't let her see, said it was Carol's business and none of Denise's, and Denise had laughed about it at the time, called it one of Walt's harmless old habits, and Pam had never thought to mention it to anyone because it had seemed like nothing. A husband keeping one small drawer closed, and she said she was sorry, in her own quiet way, for not saying something sooner, and I told her there was nothing to be sorry for, because a closed drawer is not a lie, it is just a thing nobody happened to open, and some structures hold for 13 years precisely because nobody thinks to test them. Before she hung up, Pam said one more thing, almost as an afterthought, that stayed with me longer than the rest of the call. She said Denise had never once, in 4 years, asked to see Walt's will, or any estate paperwork at all, because she said she found it distasteful, planning around a person's death while they were still living, and I understood. Hearing that Denise's own warmth, the very quality that had made her so easy to love, had also been the reason she never once thought to check the foundation of the house she was standing in, because a woman who finds it distasteful to look too closely at death is also, without meaning to be, a woman who will not notice the one drawer that was never opened. My father, once the fog of 2 years began lifting the way fog does when the sun that had been blocking it finally moves, quietly reviewed the marina's books himself for the first time since his stroke, sitting at his own kitchen table with his weak hand and a magnifying glass, and found what a man who ran that business for 30 years knows how to find. A pattern of comfortable hours and uncomfortable numbers, and he did not have Trent arrested, and he did not make a scene, he simply told him, gently but without room for negotiation, that the marina needed a manager who opened before 9, and Trent left Brunswick for Jacksonville that same month. And I am told he tells people down there that his stepfather's family froze him out of a business he built, and I have made a strange peace with that, because some people need a villain, and I would rather be the villain in Trent's story than the trustee in the one where I said nothing. Denise still lives in the house on Egret Lane. I want that understood clearly, because this is not a story about a woman who won by putting a person out on the street. My father chose, and continues to choose, to stay married to her, and I have come to believe that some of what they built together in those good years, the soup when his back went out, the years of a widower learning to smile again, was real, even alongside everything that was not. What changed is smaller than a divorce and larger than it looks. My father had the deed pulled and read for himself, with Harold Ames sitting beside him at the kitchen table, and he understood, finally, in his own words, exactly what he owned and what he did not, and what would happen to each piece of it when he was gone. Denise was in the room for that conversation. She did not object to any of it. I do not know whether that is peace or simply the recognition of a fight already lost, and I have decided I do not need to know which. My father calls me himself now, on Sundays, his own voice, his own hand dialing, and some Sundays it is a short call. How's the weather? How's Owen? Nothing. And I have learned that nothing, from a father who spent 2 years mostly silent, is its own kind of everything. He asked me once, a few weeks after the porch, whether I had known about the trust the whole time, all those years, and I told him the truth, that I had known since I sat beside my mother in Harold Ames's office at 26 years old, and that she had made me promise never to tell him unless the day came that I needed to, because she did not want him living the rest of his life feeling watched. He was quiet on the phone for a long moment, and then he said, "That sounds exactly like her," and there was something in his voice that was almost a laugh, worn thin by grief, but still, unmistakably, a laugh, and I understood that he was not angry at either of us. He was grieving her all over again, freshly, the particular way you grieve someone when you discover, years later, one more way they were taking care of you after they were already gone. My father calls me himself now. On Sundays, his own voice, his own hand dialing, and some Sundays it is a short call. How's the weather? How's Owen? Nothing. And I have learned that nothing, from a father who spent 2 years mostly silent, is its own kind of everything. He asked me once, a few weeks after the porch, whether I had known about the trust the whole time, all those years, and I told him the truth, that I had known since I sat beside my mother in Harold Ames's office at 26 years old, and that she had made me promise never to tell him unless the day came that I needed to, because she did not want him living the rest of his life feeling watched. He was quiet on the phone for a long moment, and then he said, "That sounds exactly like her," and there was something in his voice that was almost a laugh, worn thin by grief, but still, unmistakably, a laugh, and I understood that he was not angry at either of us. He was grieving her all over again, freshly, the particular way you grieve someone when you discover, years later, one more way they were taking care of you after they were already gone. Owen and I drove down for dinner about 2 months after the porch, the first time I had been back to the house on Egret Lane since the day of the box, and I want to describe that evening honestly, because it was not a triumphant return, it was smaller and stranger than that. Denise cooked, the way she always had, and set the table with her own good dishes, rather than my mother's, which I noticed and said nothing about, and the 4 of us sat down, my father, Denise, Owen, and me, and for the first 20 minutes nobody said anything about the porch at all. We talked about the heron, about a storm that had come through, about Owen's work, ordinary dinner table nothing, and it was excruciating in the specific way that ordinary things become excruciating when everyone at the table is holding something extraordinary very carefully underneath it. It was my father who finally set his fork down and said it plainly, looking at Denise and not at me. He said, "I told Lauren the truth on the porch, and I want to say it again here, at this table, so nobody has to wonder what I actually think. I want to keep living in this house with you, Denise, for as long as I've got, and I want the house to go to Lauren when I'm gone, because that was Carol's wish, and it was a good one, and I'm not going to spend whatever years I have left arguing with a dead woman's good sense." Denise did not say anything for a long moment, and then she said, quietly, without the warmth performed for anyone, that she supposed she had gotten used to thinking of the house as theirs in a way it had never actually been, and that she was still working out how to feel about that. And I told her, and I meant it, that I was not in any hurry for her to feel any particular way about it, that the house was not going anywhere, and neither, as far as I could tell, was my father's marriage, and that the only thing that had actually changed was that everyone at the table now knew the truth at the same time, instead of some of us knowing it and some of us being managed around it. It was not warm, that dinner, but it was honest, and I have come to believe that honest is worth more than warm, in a family that spent years mistaking one for the other. I called Harold Ames the week after that dinner, mostly just to tell him how it had gone, because I had not spoken to him since the night he told me not to soften it, and he listened to the whole thing without interrupting, the way he listens to everything, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment on the line, and then he said something I did not expect. He said, "Your mother would have hated the porch part, all those people watching, she was a private woman, but she would have been satisfied, and there's a difference between those two feelings that most people never get to learn, and I think you just learned it." I asked him what he meant, and he said, "Satisfied doesn't need an audience, Lauren. It just needs the thing to have held." And I have turned that sentence over many times since, sitting at my own table with my mother's china in front of me, because I think it is the truest thing anyone said to me in the entire 4 months, truer even than anything said on the porch itself, and I think it is the sentence I would hand to anyone else carrying a locked box for someone they loved, not knowing yet whether they would ever need to open it. Here is the last thing, and then I will let you go. My mother's wedding china, the 12-place settings Denise handed me in a cardboard box on that porch as a kind of settlement, sits now in my own dining room in Savannah, unwrapped, in the break front my father built for it 30 years ago, and Owen and I drove down to collect the same week as the porch. I use it. Not for holidays, not saved for company. I use it on ordinary Tuesdays, because my mother once told me the good china that only comes out twice a year has failed at the one job china actually has, which is to be part of an ordinary life. I think about that a great deal now, about the difference between a thing that is protected and a thing that is only stored, about a house kept safe for a man to actually live in versus a house kept as an asset to be liquidated, about a woman who spent the last 18 months of her own life quietly building a structure strong enough to hold her husband's whole future upright, 13 years before anyone would need it to bear weight, and who never once asked to be thanked for it, because she was not doing it to be thanked, she was doing it the way I check a beam, because she loved the thing enough to make sure it would not fail when no one was looking. I think, too, about the particular kind of love my mother's plan required of me, which nobody talks about enough in stories like this one. It is one thing to be handed a weapon in a moment of crisis and use it. It is another thing entirely to be handed a locked box at 26 years old, told you may never need to open it, and asked to carry it, unopened, for 13 years, through your own wedding and your father's remarriage and 100 Sunday dinners where the temptation to simply mention it, to relieve some private ache of being underestimated, must have been sitting right there the whole time. I never told Owen the specifics until the week before the porch, not because I did not trust him, but because my mother's request had become, over 13 years, less like a secret and more like a discipline. The same discipline that lets me sign my name to a structural report and mean it. The discipline of not speaking until you are certain, and of trusting that certainty, once earned, does not need an audience to be true. I do not know if I would have had that discipline without her example, without watching her, in the last months of her life, do the hardest, quietest kind of planning there is, which is planning for a future she would not be alive to see, and trusting a 26-year-old daughter to be the only living witness to it. There is a particular Tuesday I keep coming back to, a few weeks ago now. Nothing special about it on the surface. Owen at work, me home early from a site visit that finished ahead of schedule, and I found myself setting our small table for dinner with my mother's china, for no reason at all, no guests coming, no occasion, just because the plates were there and it was supper time. And I stood at the window while the pasta water came up to a boil, and I could see, if I leaned a certain way, a sliver of the river past the neighbor's fence. Nothing like the water off Egret Lane, just a gray Savannah tidal creek doing what it always does. And I thought about my mother sitting in Harold Ames's office 13 years before any of this, planning a future she would never see. For a husband who would go on to love someone else, and a daughter who would go on to spend 14 years finding cracks in other people's buildings before she ever had to find one in her own family. And I set the last plate down and I thought, simply, she did this so I would not have to stand at somebody else's window someday, wondering if I had a home. And then the water boiled over a little, the way it always does if you get lost in a thought at the stove, and I turned back to the ordinary business of an ordinary Tuesday, which is, I have come to understand, exactly what she wanted for me all along. I did not build that trust. I only carried the folder. But I have spent 14 years learning to find the one point in a structure where the weight is not going where everyone assumes it is going. And it turns out my mother taught me that skill years before I ever set foot in an engineering classroom. Sitting beside her in a quiet office on Bull Street, watching a dying woman make absolutely certain that love, in our family, would still have a foundation standing under it long after she was gone. Some evenings, setting that ordinary Tuesday table with her good china, I think about how strange it is that the safest thing she ever built for us was not the trust itself, airtight as Harold Ames made it, but the patience underneath it, the 13 years of nobody needing to know, and I understand now that the patience was the real inheritance. The china and the house were only ever the proof of it.